Hey, Whiskey Ringers, it is the end of spring and almost into summer, and I have some big updates for you. First off, in case you haven't heard, we are going to be doing our first ever Whiskey Ring podcast barrel pick. It is going to be not one, but two barrels of Jack Daniel's Barrel Proof Rye straight from Lynchburg. And if that wasn't incentive enough, one of your fellow patrons, a patron at the $25 level, is going to be joining me for the pick. This is going to be the first pick of many. If you want your chance to be part of a pick team, this is the perfect time to up that Patreon pledge to $25. There are only 4 spots available at that tier.
Hey folks, welcome to another episode. I am thrilled to bring on someone I actually met through another friend of ours, Mr. James Walt, who is the head of Pure Malts, another group that we get to do a lot of tastings with and a lot of whiskey experiences with. So I'm thrilled to bring on Mr. Angus MacRaild of WhiskySponge and Decadent Drinks. Angus, welcome.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I wanted to have you on as soon as I met you with the first WhiskySponge tasting we did with James. Now we've done 2, I think, maybe 3. And I've been incredibly impressed with the whiskey coming out, as well as your own just thought process. So thought we'd dig a little deeper into this. So let's just start with give people a chance to understand your journey. So what's been your history in having to do with whiskey and spirits and all of that?
So whiskey has really been a lifelong thing for me, which I think stemmed from the fact that when we moved from Scotland down to England when I was like 3 or 4, I missed Scotland, and it made me naturally disposed to like Scottish things and be interested in Scottish things. So Scottish food, Scottish music, Scottish history, all these sorts of things. And my dad enjoyed whiskey. He was not a whiskey geek by any measure. He was a casual whiskey drinker who liked whiskey and would like a bottle of malt whiskey maybe once or twice a year as a sort of treat. And my mum would buy him peaty whiskies from Islay, Kalila, Lafroig, things like that. Those were his tastes and the whiskies he enjoyed. And I really distinctly remember him expressing quite a just natural passion for the flavor of peat in whiskey, and particularly Lafroig. Lafroig was always his favorite. And that struck a chord with me because my dad was really, my hero growing up, like a lot of, young boys, I suppose. And I remember reading the back of the bottles occasionally, and we would sometimes go, we'd visit Scotland regularly. And my uncle, who lived up in Scotland by Lochfine, had loads of bottles around the place because he worked in fish farming, and it was just absolutely standard that you would gift people bottles of whiskey in that kind of world, that part of Scotland, that culture. The number of bottles that he got given, which in that era, you're talking whiskies which are now worth a lot of money, and whiskies which we would consider very serious drams today. So I was exposed to whiskey initially through that, and I had a natural interest. So one thing led to another, and it was not unsurprising that I think when I became a teenager, I started reading more about it. So I would read whiskey books, and I remember reading Appreciating Whiskey by Pip Hills, who founded the SMWS. And that really, when I was like a 13, 14, I was really quite interested in that. And so when I went to uni and had a big long summers at university, go and do something else. So I sought out work on Islay at Ardbeg Distillery. I went there, first summer just for a break. I'd never been to Islay, really wanted to go. Of course, had a great experience. 2004 in Islay, you could taste incredible things in the warehouse. The first whiskey I ever tasted from the cask was an absolutely enormous dram of 1975 Ardbeg, handed to me in a highball glass by Stuart Thompson while I was camping at the distillery for an evening. So these are really profound experiences which imprint themselves very deeply on, a young mind. I was only 18 at the time. And so 2005, 2006, worked at Ardbeg for 2 full summers doing tour guiding. And that was really the kickoff for me. That was what got me a very quick and quite deep education in a lot of aspects of whiskey. And I got the bug, I got the passion. I met a lot of people that came over from Europe that were really old bottle nerds, proper geeks. It was the first time I witnessed, we Belgian guys with car boots full of sample bottles of all sorts of, hundreds of different whiskies. And I just thought this is such a weird, cool, fun, nice culture and delicious whiskies. And I remember trying Lagavulin 12-year-old white label, White Horse bottling from late 70s. And that again was just out of some guy's car boot in Ardbeg car park. And I'd known about things like old bottles for a long time. I was reading loads of stuff on the internet. I was sort of absorbing this world, this culture. But that old bottle was one that really made me go, holy shit, these are different. And there's a world of history and flavor and questions to be sort of discovered there. So I suppose that was the journey to the point where there was no going back. And from there, I just sort of, I don't know, I didn't have a plan. I never had a plan, just stumbled into a career. I really loved writing, so it seemed inevitable that I would do some writing around whiskey. And of course, that thing that I took away from my experience on Islay was real deep interest in old bottles, old and rare whiskies. Why do whiskies from the past taste different? And so that led me a few years later, after I'd done some traveling and worked elsewhere, worked in a vineyard, worked in London in a whiskey bar, worked in wine merchants in Glasgow, things like that. I got a job in an auction house called Mulberry Bank Auctions in Glasgow, and that was really the start of my proper, I suppose, modern career in whiskey, was working in auctions, dealing with old and rare whiskies and sourcing them, identifying counterfeit bottles, and trying to, and learning a lot as you go along. So it was just sort of stumbling through, really. And then years later, here I am, I'm doing independent bottling, which I never expected to be doing, and starting a distillery, which I always dreamed to be doing, but I'm still kind of a bit shell-shocked that we kind of almost about gotten over the line with that. So yeah, and I don't know where everything will be 10 years from now either, but I like what I'm doing. I love what I'm doing. I love whiskey. And, I hope that comes across in the things I say, the products I put out, and, the way I go about dealing with it, really.
So, I mean, the two biggest questions that come out of that for me are, number one, between Lefroy being your father's favorite, spent time at Ardbeg, got to try, and Lagavulin as well. Has the Islay profile in general remained your go-to or your favorite with Scotch profiles?
If you put, I don't know, I was going to say, if you put matches under my fingernails and force me to make a decision, I probably would say the sort of fruity old style Islay whiskey flavor is probably my favorite, which to me really is Lafroig and Bowmore from the 60s and earlier. I've realized that I come to love whiskies which exhibit tropical fruits, very naturally present peat smoke character, which is not to say modern peat smoke where it's just a wall of ash and dryness and like pure power. I like deep organic peat smoke that is incepted into the whiskey in more old-fashioned, less efficient ways. And I love waxiness, texture, fatness of spirit. I love whiskies which taste of the distillery where they've come from, and you can dig in and investigate and get into the weeds of how that flavor has been put into the whiskey in that way. So that means obviously Lefroy, Bowmore, Old Lagavulins, every single Islay distillery has made astonishing whiskey in the past, and some of them still today. And so that is naturally, and because of my experiences and my dad's favorite being Lefroy, my favorite is definitely Lefroy from an emotional perspective, a personal perspective, for sure. But I also love Talisker. I love the West Coast whiskies generally. I love Oban, for example. I think so. Such an underdog, underappreciated malt. I love Highland Park because similarly, I think Orkney is such a spellbinding, incredible place, and the flavor of Orcadian peat when it's manifest in the whiskey in a very clear and vivid way, like you get with a lot of these, not so much the distillery bottlings of Highland Park, but the modern day Orkney malt parcels of stock which are around, and we bottled a few of them. And when you get a good one, it's just absolutely gorgeous. This beautiful, very Orcadian, very specific flavor of like herbal, dry, elegant peat smoke that also brings along waxes and mineral flavors. And then I love certain mainland distilleries like Glen Grant. Old Glen Grant is just absolutely spellbinding, captivating. It's so elegant. It's got such finesse, depth, complexity, and just class. It's a whiskey that is sheer class, sheer beauty. And because it's been bottled, it was considered one of the best whiskies decades before Macallan was a name. Glen Grant was the name. And you can tell that by the sheer volume of bottlings of Glen Grant as a single malt going back decades. And for an old bottle nerd like me, it's a wonderful name because you can find so many examples at high strength, low strength, different ages, young, old, and you can really see the greatness of it, the diversity of it, its adaptability to great age and youth. And, plain oak that's completely knackered and the most active sherry casks, it can do anything. And that to me is, just brilliant. And that's why I've got such a soft spot for Glen Grant. And I said Talisker, I think, but yeah, Talisker as well is, my God, the old Talisker is just exquisite. And my family, MacRaild, we come from Skye originally, not so, just my dad's great grandfather, was born on Skye, worked there until he was 14, and then walked on the length of the West Highland Railway to get work in Glasgow. Just a different generation, very hardy, total different existence. But we've got a lot of roots on Skye. So Talisker obviously has an emotional aspect, but absolutely a qualitative aspect as well, because it is a beautiful whiskey. So yeah, those sorts of drams. And then of course as well, you go to the East Coast, Clynelish, because it's just such a brutally charismatic, persistently charismatic make, and it is the epitome of waxiness in whiskey. So it's very hard not to be charmed by it, and it's an obvious one for me to love. There's many more I could talk. You've asked a difficult question because I'm just talking witter away for hours on that subject.
No, it's fine. It's a favorite child question on one hand. It's when you're dealing with independent bottling in particular, plus your knowledge of older bottlings, just from experience, it was a tougher question than it would be for most. Let's put it that way. So,
I don't know. I mean, for me, it's not tough. It's only tough in the sense that you pull on that thread of what's your favorite, what do you love, and if you really love whiskey, you start just wittering on, talking for ages because you think, oh, that one, oh, and then that one, oh, I should talk about that as well. But so I don't think it's a difficult question, really. I suppose I just struggle to stop once I start talking about it. That's all.
That's fair. Look, when I get asked that question, I love Highland Park as well.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it was my intro to peat. I couldn't really handle the Lafroigs or even the Ardbegs until I got to Highland Park.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I got to use that heathery peat as an intro point, I'll be honest, I still can't handle Lafroig most of the time. It's still too much for me.
Have you tried some older Lafroigs, like sort of say bottled early 90s, bottled 80s?
I don't believe so. I've only really tried the modern stuff.
We'll talk afterwards, but I probably send you a sample or something because that's something that is usually quite a revelation for people if they don't like Lafroig. If you try the stuff that was distilled from like early 80s and before, then it's a totally different experience. Like modern Lafroig is very powerful. I still think modern Lafroig is a great distillate. And I have mixed feelings about what the owners do with it, but I certainly think the core DNA is still pretty profound and vivid and very good. But old stuff is beautiful. Tropical fruits with like much more wispy, elegant, delicate peat smoke. It's a fascinating whiskey. So yeah, I would recommend that. But I think if you got the peat bug from Highland Park, I think you would really like the sort of old Lafroigs because they're on a much more similar kind of equilibrium in terms of their peat character. Those two whiskies, I would say.
Sure, I would definitely be open to trying. I'll try everything once.
I will send you a sample of some old Lafroig and remind me I'll do that.
we had an episode a few weeks or maybe a month ago at this point, depending on when this goes live, with Eimverk in Iceland. And they're most famous, of course, for their Floki sheepdung smoked whiskey, which was not what people think it is. It was much closer to just an earthy smoke. But again, I'm willing to try anything once. So
I've heard about this sheep dung smoked whiskey. I've not tried any yet. I know there's someone in Tasmania doing similar funky things. I'm also similarly quite open to trying anything like this. I think that's part of the fun, is keeping an open mind and trying all these crazy things.
you have to. Yeah, I wish I still had some. I would trade you, but I only had a sample myself, but it's it's worth trying, for sure. And it's not that expensive either. But with with Pete in particular, just before I leave that thread, for me with Lefroy, the and maybe this is the modernity aspect. I struggle with the overly medicinal, well, the iodine and really heavy tar notes on it. That being said, I loved the PX Cartridge release from maybe 2
Mhm.
3 years ago. So it's heavily sherried in such a way that it kind of balances the smoke. Then
Have
it
you
can
tried
handle.
the sherry oak 10-year-old version that they've done? Or the sherry, there's a sherry finish 10-year-old 48% bottling, which I think is it's a really nice example. I don't think I've tried the PX Cargis bottling, but I imagine it's something along a similar lines. So yeah, I would definitely recommend trying that. But I totally take your point about peat in Lefroy being quite medicinal. It's always been a medicinal whiskey. Um, but that speaks to one of the things I fundamentally love most about peated whiskey, is that when it's done properly, which in my view is floor malted on site at the distillery and using a peat source which is, reasonably indigenous to that area. And it's, there's been studies that prove that uh, different peat sources with different composition from different bogs are going to deliver a different phenolic signature in the whiskey. And that is one of the most powerful um, elements of terroir. If you want to get into that, if you want to pursue that in production, or even just localism, a sense of individuality and idiosyncrasy about a whiskey, peat can do that in one of the most like clear and profound ways. And it's not really even talked about that much as an ingredient in whiskey in many respects. It's just sort of assumed. And it's transitioned from being a fuel source that was essential to a flavoring agent, which is optional. But I think that's it's very interesting what you say about your way into it was through Highland Park rather than Lefroy, because that's one of the things I think is most brilliant about the difference between Islay and Orkney, is you get very, very clear different profiles of peat from those two islands. I mean, Orkney peat is essentially just pure heather, whereas Islay peat is it's taking in things like sphagnum moss and seaweed, and it's a more varied composite of peat, and it delivers a much more medicinal characteristic, a much more medicinal phenolic signature. And certainly when you try the older Islay whiskies from 60s, 50s, even 70s, when distilleries were still operating floor maltings, the peat flavor becomes even more pronounced and varied between the distilleries. And same with Highland Park. I mean, Highland Park from 50s, 60s is a much peatier whiskey than today, but also a much more specific flavor of peat, like true Orcadian peat, very dry, very herbal, very organic, deep, earthy, rooty peat. Such a beautiful flavor. Probably one of the best, like, top 5 whiskies I ever tasted was a Highland Park 10-year-old from the late 40s. One of the most peaty whiskies I ever tasted, not in the sort of Octomore sense, but just in such a deep, weighty, dense, thick power of peat. It's just mind blowing. So, yeah, I totally see where you're coming from, and yeah, I agree. It's quite an enchanting whiskey, Highland Park, when it's pure and sort of true to its distillery house style.
Absolutely. And not to say that we're going off on a huge tangent about peat, but I saw an opening to ask you about that because I know you've written about it in the past, and from my experience, initially not being able to handle peat at all, maybe a Johnny Walker Black level of peat at most.
Mhm.
So just the smoky aspect of it. Now, I love a Kalila. It's my favorite Isla is Kalila,
Oh, cool.
and of course Highland Park and all these peats that I'm trying from around the world. And I think if you haven't gotten a chance to try it, the Waterford peated expressions.
I have actually tasted a couple at Whiskey Live Paris last year,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
I can't remember the names because Waterford put out a lot of whiskies, and I'm not great at remembering all the different names. But it was definitely two. It was two different peat sources or two different peat influences, and I did try them, and I was impressed. They are. I think Waterford makes very good whiskey. I think it's a bit, perhaps still a bit young, maybe a bit muddled, and there's a lot of messaging around terroir, not all of which I necessarily agree with, but I certainly think that the base whiskey that they're making is very interesting, and I like the fact that it's quite different from bottling to bottling, and I certainly enjoyed the peated versions. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I had to try them each a few times to one decide if I even liked them, and then tease out what was different between them. Of course, from central mainland Ireland versus Scotland or Great Lakes peat here. So there's an event on the horizon at some point I'd love to do that's just peat around the world. Different sources of peat, Danish, American, from Indiana, like things that show that that is part of, if you want to call it terroir, fine. I'm a believer in terroir, but not an evangelist for it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's probably my position as well. It's a good way to
Yeah,
sum it up, I think. But that sounds a great idea. I love the idea of doing that,
yeah,
comparing sources from different distilleries around the world. I mean, it's the sort of thing that you could even really go to town and ask, identify which distilleries you'd want to do and maybe get them to actually support something like that and send, rather than bottlings, maybe say, look, can we have cast samples just from like the same age, the same cast type, so you could really get the most uniform view possible on the peat aspect. That would be a very cool thing to do.
those are connections that you've got so far. I got to work up to those, but we'll we'll get there. We'll get there one day for sure. It's fascinating. And I like interesting things like that that really get to the nerdy aspect of
Yeah.
whiskey. So, so with that, let's move into your history with WhiskySponge.
Yeah.
So, for people who may not know, this is a blog that's been around for about 10 years now, 10, 11 years.
5, 10 years, yeah.
And it's very simple, whiskysponge.com, no E in the whiskey. We're talking Scotland right now, so no E in the whiskey. And in your own words, and this was from not another whiskey podcast, this was last year, you said that WhiskySponge was created to, quote, take the piss out of the ridiculous things that happen in whiskey.
I think
And
it's still accurate, yeah.
yeah, um, you also said that it's not as scathing now as it used to be, uh, but I still find the posts enjoyably scathing.
Yeah, I mean,
So
I think the whole scathing thing is that I think people perhaps miss the fact that a lot of WhiskySponge is just it's closer more to surrealism than satire in some respects. It's, I've got quite a specific sense of humor that I suppose mixes together surrealist sort of nonsense along with sci-fi interests and philosophy and also satire. Like, you know, there is a huge component of WhiskySponge, which is obviously satirical, but the really scathing, more barred, more pointed pieces tend to be reserved more for the big guys that can handle it. I don't think, you know, satire should punch down. I think the question of satire is, who does it hurt, who does it help, and I don't think I've always got that right on WhiskySponge. I've tried to, but I think the majority of the really brutalistic pieces are at big, you know, very large companies that can damn well take it, and usually for a good reason, because they've done something that is just, you know, naff or stupid or insulting. And in between all that, it's largely me just poking fun at my friends or having fun with in jokes and silly names and wordplay and gibberish and just general kind of surrealistic nonsense. And that's just because, you know, it's a very fun thing and a fun way to write, and it's a hobby. And I am, you know, keenly aware that I just don't have the time to do it very often anymore. You know, there's very few posts on Sponge nowadays, and I'm loath to, you know, kill it off and draw a line under it and finish it up. I don't know. I did think about doing that this year because it's 10 years, and I thought maybe it makes sense just to kind of just put a line in the sand and tie it off neatly. I don't know. We'll see. I still love sitting down and writing a post whenever I get time to. And there are plenty of occasions when I'll see something and it just, you know, I get the kind of Scottish rage and think, this is just atrocious. It needs to be brought down a peg or two. But, you know, the flip side of that is that there's actually too many occasions like that. There's so much nonsense. You know, when you take a lot of the stuff about pricing adjustments, stuff around investment, stuff around, you know, any number of stupid branding things that companies are doing, and yeah, there's just so much. There's too much material. You know, I could spend all my time writing satirical posts, but it doesn't, you know, it doesn't pay the bill. So you have to put your time towards what does, especially when you have a mortgage and a young family and things like that. So yeah, but you know, I still love Sponge. I'm very happy with it. I'm always happy when I get nice feedback and people say that they enjoyed it or they found it funny. And it's, you know, for better or worse, it's become my kind of mouthpiece. If I want to write something that's personal and or you know, a traditional Sponge post or whatever, if I want to say something, then it's the obvious place for me to do that. So I shouldn't be too hasty in you know, stopping it or trying to change things up. But yeah, absolutely, it's still very much what it always was, I suppose.
So I will fully admit up front, I haven't read every single post that has gone on, but since being first exposed to WhiskySponge, I've tried to read a lot of it because I'm interested, and I also love. I don't have the Scottish rage, let's say. I tend to be a little bit more
Probably
measured.
just as well for your health.
Probably. I would say, but I do look at a lot of these things on that come up on Instagram or on the news sites that are just like, Jesus Christ, man! Like, how many people did this go through before it got to this place, and it's still going out? You know, a recent example was there's a whiskey being sent up into space, and the bottle is shaped, let's say, very phallically, and even with a flared base and everything. So, you know, take that for what you will. And it's going to go for maybe 75,000 a bottle when it finally comes to market.
There's been a proper space race in whiskey, like the Ardbeg. I'm sure, was it Ardbeg that started it by trying to send whiskey into space, and then, you know, it's just the ultimate like bullshit, quite chauvinist, quite you know, it's sort of desperation, straw clutching marketing, you know, just scrabbling around in the dark for any kind of story that'll help shift product. You know, and what does space really have to do with whiskey or vice versa? It's such a flagrant, blatant,
Mhm.
absence of ideas, absence of creativity, just kind of, and especially when the end product comes back and it's got a five-figure price tag slapped on it, like you just alluded to.
Yeah.
That is, you know, that what can you say? It's such a piss take, such a slap in the face, and it's just insulting. But then whiskey's always tried to rinse rich idiots for their coin. So
Sure.
perhaps this is just the next stage in that evolution.
Well, I read it, and I was on a train home from the Indie Spirits Expo in New York. So just tasted a bunch of different products that were promising, but also, in an affordable sense. They were accessible.
Yeah.
And then I see this thing come up, and I'm conversing with an influencer on Instagram. Just go back and forth with posts. And on one hand, I was thinking, like, what would you write about when you saw this as a let's say quasi satirical, or really, you know harder than that piece? And then I said, it's going to be going up in an unmanned capsule and then come back down. And someone said, well, you're putting a flammable liquid in in
Yeah.
space, and then you're going to have it re-enter and in an incredibly hot environment. That couldn't go wrong, right? And my first thought was, well, this is a bottle that's going to be $75,000. If it explodes in the atmosphere, of course, no injuries or anything like that. But if it explodes out of an unmanned capsule, that's probably the best of both worlds, because a big explosion of this whiskey in the atmosphere is probably the closest most of us are going to get to seeing it anyway. So we might as well make it a party.
Yeah, and it reminds me of like one of the Sponge headlines I was most pleased with was when Ardbeg put some whiskey into space, and Ardbeg puts the NAS in NASA, which I was reasonably chuffed with. I think I got an email from, or a few emails from industry people. In fact, some Ardbeg people saying they were impressed with that one, so that was good. Uh, yeah, I mean, I don't know. There's any number of angles you can take on something like that. I'm sure I could come up with some suitably scathing thing if I sat down and thought about it for a wee while. But uh, it's yeah, the thing that always strikes me about these things is they just smack of like kind of desperation. It's just like, and even though it's obviously a very operationally complex and expensive thing to achieve, is put whiskey in space. But you think, well, it's actually, is it easier or is it harder just to instead, really do the legwork and make or source excellent product and present and brand it in a way which is uh, quality focused and honest and interesting, and do the sales legwork to, get it out there and get liquid into people's glasses and do all this sort of, it's like people are bored of these traditional ways, or they just can't be arsed to do the hard work that is involved in putting out quality. So they just come up with these harebrained, you know, endeavors. I mean, putting whiskey into space. I don't know. I just think it's so boring and so unimaginative. I mean, I don't know. I could be wrong. Maybe it's the future. I don't know. But like, I don't know. If someone distilled some whiskey in zero gravity, or genuinely put a hogshead of whiskey up into deep space, I'd be pretty curious about the results, but not to the tune of you know half the price of a house.
That's fair, of course. And yeah, well, okay, so this leads into another question I wanted to ask. And this is really, um, perhaps partly for the audience, but also really a question from me as well, which is, you've also said recently that and this goes to your writing, and I'm qualifying this a lot, but this goes to your writing process and not having enough time and all of that. So I said samples are the problem. Like, getting samples to try is not the problem. It's keeping up with the writing.
Yeah.
And I'll fully admit, I'm looking at my office right now. I've got, I don't know how many things here that I just, even if I taste them and write down tasting notes, I don't have the creative capacity to write something beyond the tasting notes for every single thing. Which,
Yeah, absolutely.
it in your words, it chafes me a little bit, because I'm like, I want to, like, I'm excited to get to that point where I'm getting samples, getting things to try, and I want to tell people about them, good, bad, or otherwise. But there's also just so much that you can't keep up.
You can't do everything, and I'm very much the same. I've got, sitting in this office, there's a sea of samples out of shot here. Much of it for work, a huge amount of it for you know, writing notes or writing, writing reviews or whatever. And you can't do everything. It is too much. It's impossible to keep on top of that level of sort of input. And I choose not to try and do it all, because there's no point in really pushing or rushing and doing a bad job or doing a whiskey disservice, especially if there's a critical edge where you're going to write down and publish your opinion about it. Write some tasting notes. I really don't like using the word review, because, like, for instance, if I write notes for WhiskyFun, it's my personal opinion and it's a hobby, and I really don't like this idea that it's being reviewed. But if you do write notes and there is some kind of critical component to that, then you want to be able to take your time, do a fair and honest job, and give a truthful summation of your opinions and your experience of that whiskey. So there's, I think, in the same way of writing the sponge or writing anything, less is more. If I really want to do something, I will do it, and I will carve out the necessary time to do a good job of it. It does mean I get a lot of messages from people. Have you tried this yet? Are you going to try that? When can you? And I understand that, but you just can't rush these things. I think it's very, very true about writing that you're more likely to do a good job if you kind of store it up and let things stew, and you've really got a clear idea of what you want to do, why you're writing it, what your truth is, and you wait till you've really got that inside you and that energy behind you, and then you go and you write it and you do it, and it's a good job, and you do a meticulous and thorough job of it. And that is my approach a bit, and it's certainly my less is more approach. I take a very long-term view of my career, and the things that I do or things I say. I would rather, if I say something or write something or put something out there, I would like it to have meaning and be interesting and be worthwhile reading. The internet and the world are stuffed full of opinion enough as it is, and 9 times out of 10 it doesn't need mine. It doesn't need my 2 cents on something. And often I don't have anything interesting to add or say to a debate necessarily. There's plenty of people that will have already made similar points to what I would have. So I'm usually trying to think about, well, I should probably write something at some point in the near future. What should I actually write? What would be interesting? It's one of the reasons why I don't really do paid writing work anymore, because A, it doesn't pay very well, and editors often just say, oh, you think of what to write, you think about it. And it's like, that is hard work. Writers and creative people generally want to work to more specific, tighter briefs and commissions. They want to have some parameters imposed upon them, because it's actually a little easier sometimes, I think, creatively, to work within defined parameters. People just expect the creative to always just come up with everything out of the blue. That's actually quite hard, quite challenging, and not very freeing in many ways, because it's really just placing the burden on someone else. But anyway, that's a bit of a diversion. But yeah, I totally hear you, and I agree with what you're saying about, you get the sense of too much, or there's just this sort of slightly overwhelming feeling of things piling up and just not being able to get to them. But yeah, I think it's important to resist the urge to rush or to try and do everything, and fall into the trap of perhaps doing not as good a job as you would otherwise have done.
Wolfburn Distillery captures the spirit of Scotland's far north. As the northernmost distillery on the Scottish mainland, Wolfburn ties together long fermentation, slow distillation, and seaside maturation for unique and superb character. Originally founded in 1821, this exceptional distillery was restored in 2012 to its original greatness, resurrecting a 200-year-old distillery on the largest blanket peat bog in all of Europe. Whether you're drinking Northland, Wolfburn's first expression, aged in American oak quarter casks, Aurora, a beautiful sherried whiskey laid down in a combination of bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks, Morvern, their lightly peated variety, or Langskip, their cask-strength release, there's a Wolfburn for everyone. Arriving to the States later this year is their first permanent age-stated release, the 10-year-old. You can also find small batch releases and limited edition bottlings at specialty retailers across the U.S. Reach out to our friends at Impex Beverages for more information on where to find your favorite expression. Wolfburn Distillery. Fortune favors the brave.
And I very much appreciate you articulating that, because I've been struggling with that as a writer, and this is a slight diversion to my own writing. I'm struggling with that because you get so many things, and there are things that I'm excited about that I don't get to write about because it's just too much, or between that and the podcast and all of that. And you face the same thing with, you've got independent bottling, you have a family, you've got all these things happening, and occasionally something will break through. Like I was in London 2 months ago now. Went to the Whiskey Exchange. I tried the Damunak release.
The 6-year-old.
Yes, yeah. Loved it. And as far as ghost distilleries go, Imperial is my favorite.
Nice.
Unfortunately, yeah, from a price standpoint, unfortunately, but it is my favorite. But in learning about the Damunak and its ties to Imperial, both geographical, tangible, and intangible, there I saw an opportunity to write something that would be a little different, particularly for what I know is a heavily American audience. To say, why should I care about this Scotch that's, only available through Whiskey Exchange and a distillery whose products I will probably never see, but making that point, that is something that I was like, okay, I want to take the time to write about this because there's something to add here, as opposed to, I have this fantasy of getting Elijah Craig barrel proof samples from Heaven Hill because it's always been a favorite bourbon of mine. And on one hand, I would be excited about it because I've still got the only site that has reviews of all 12 of the old batches and tasting notes on them. But also, like, if I got a batch of the new one today, what the hell would I write about it? Even if I loved it, what would I write about it? There's nothing to add there. So that's where I find my dichotomy of, I want to try something, but I don't know if I have anything to add. To your point about where is my voice needed? Where is my voice useful?
Well, I think that's not necessarily true, because if you've developed through your previous work an element of authority and you've got some experience, then and you've demonstrated to your audience that you're truthful and you're writing because you're interested, you're not being flash, you're not being showy, you're trying to just communicate your truth about your experience of these whiskies, then I think many people would see, just to take that Elijah Craig example, if there's a new batch come along, I think many people would see your take on it as something that they'd be very interested in and would assign value to it. That's the thing that I really think is key and foundational to having something valuable to contribute to the wider whiskey conversation through writing is, are you being consistent? Are you being truthful? And can your audience trust what you write and what you say? I think that's one of the things that has made WhiskyFun successful over the years, because Serge is consistent and true to his own opinions and tastes. And over the years, cumulatively, the audience can sort of calibrate themselves to that, and it helps them to understand how they might think about a whiskey based on what he has to say about it. Which is why, even after 20 years, another 5 tasting notes for 5 random indie bottlings of Milton Duff or Leash, these are still things that people want to read and take interest in. So, and by the way, I think that a lot of people can be a bit snippy about tasting notes in this day and age, or there's all sorts of people that I think rather virtuously and disingenuously bleat on about, oh, these people got given free samples, therefore their opinion can be trusted, which I just think is gibberish. But tasting notes are still a big important part of whiskey's culture, and it's a huge part of the language of whiskey, the way that we communicate, the way that we share opinion about the actual product, the liquid that we all supposedly love. And it's the way that critical consensus can be understood and built upon and developed over time into something broader and more detailed and more meaningful. So if it's a good example of what you raise, I think, but I would always encourage you to, if you've got a tasting, a sample of a whiskey which is from an area where you've got form, you've got audience, and you've got experience, then your voice is, I would say, much more valuable than mine or something like that, because I'm not an expert on American whiskies at all. It's actually one of the areas I would most like to learn about would be American whiskies, because some of the things that have surprised me most in maybe the last year, I've had some really old bourbons which remind me just how beautiful great bourbon can be, and how sort of threadbare my experience and knowledge with it is. But anyway, that's getting off topic a bit. But yeah, absolutely. I think that being truthful, being honest, humble about working to your strengths, being honest about your gaps, your weaknesses, that kind of approach, that kind of voice is what I think people latch onto and value in whiskey and in other cultures and areas and walks of life and products and all sorts of things. Fandom, geekdom, it's a very shared foundational sort of principle and aspect, I think.
And that brings to another question about writing, which is, with the voice and the style that you've created with Sponge, I would say less so with WhiskyFun, because that's someone else's kind of baby, if you will, that you contribute to.
Yeah, I'm just a piggybacker on WhiskyFun.
Sure. but certainly for the Sponge, I mean, you made a good point earlier that I follow as well, which is, if you're going to write something really scathing, really going after something, you leave it for the ones who can take it, and don't punch down. Don't go after. I don't go after a tiny distillery or a new distillery that's just trying to get their legs under them, because then what's the point? I'll leave it to other people to be, if you'll forgive me, to be a dick about it. But if Heaven Hill or Jim Beam comes out with something big, and I think this is a ridiculous product for any number of reasons, I'll write about it, because it's, as you said, they can take it.
And I think that's absolutely true. And I've probably made errors of judgment along that lines over the years with a Sponge, and there's just in the sense that there's maybe been sometimes where I've been a little too snippy or brutal with some of the smaller guys. I don't know, but a lot of it is also, I would hope that people reading it back would see that a lot of it is quite affectionate. So, for example, writing about some other indie bottlers, or writing about a company like, I don't know, Gordon MacPhail is a good example. It's someone that's quite, it's big guy and can take it, but also quite like a lot of the things they do, and I like some of the people there. And it's when I've written about them in the past, it's generally been more from a just silly, affectionate standpoint. A lot of the my friends in the industry, Elixir Distillers gets a look in a lot of the time because I know quite a few of the people that work there, and I'm good friends with them, and it's kind of an easy target in some ways. And I also know that they have quite a collective sense of humor, and they like these sorts of ridiculous takes on some of the things they do. So it's it's a mixed bag. But yeah, I definitely try to and one of the reasons perhaps why I write less is because I try to be a bit more selective and discerning. And if I'm going to really twist the knife on someone, then I do want to think about it a bit more deeply and make sure that I think this is a deserving target, and they absolutely are a company that can take it. So yeah, I definitely think about that a lot, and I definitely agree.
With that, and then I want to make sure we have time for the distillery, and Decadent Drinks, of course, as well. But the last question I have for you on the writing side is, with what you've written, has there been a time or an occasion where you've faced blowback or even threat of legal action because of something you've written? And if so, how have you handled it?
I've had 3 legal letters from the Sponge over the years, I think. One from an auction house. I said something about McTeer's Auctions, genuine bottle of whiskey for a change. They didn't like that. They sent a letter, cease and desist. And then the most sort of punchy one was from a company called Rare Whiskey 101, when I wrote something. They put out a press release, and I pulled it apart rather savagely, and they sent a letter which was equally quite sort of savage, and I ended up just sort of conforming with it and taking the piece down as they'd requested and publishing an apology. But I made it quite clear when I published the apology. Then I said, I've received a letter, whatever. And you know what? In those situations, I don't let it bother me, and I don't think that anyone reading what I'm doing is thinking that I'm capitulating, or I think most people realize that when bigger people come after you with a legal letter, you've hit a nerve, you've done something perhaps a bit too close to the bone, too close to the truth. That's, in some senses, that's when satire is kind of at its most powerful, is when it provokes these people into some kind of action or response. And at the end of the day, they spent money on lawyers, and I didn't, and that's okay. It's not the most, I suppose, the most difficult feedback was not legal. It was when and I can't remember what the post is. I wrote a post sort of picking on an article I'd read, which was being shared a lot and just seemed like I didn't agree with it. And I sort of wrote more of a reactionary post, and I think it upset the guy who'd written the article. And that was a good example of when I think my judgment was quite wrong, and it was, you could argue, it was more punching down. And so that, hearing, I think that it probably got to him a bit. A guy who was a perfectly nice guy. I just happened to be in the wrong frame of mind, read this article, and reacted the way I did. And so something like that, I think, is more of a learning curve for me, and sticks in my head a lot more than anything to do with any legal letters or anything like that. Which I think is just part and parcel of being a writer and taking on feedback and learning from it, and that which affects you and gives you pause for thought, versus that which you might feel like is an attack, but or a pushback or a criticism, And you can choose how to take that. You think about it, you absorb it, and you absorb, and you respond accordingly. And I find that by and large, reaction to the sponge over the years has been very positive. And actually, I think most of the biggest fans of it are within the industry. I think a lot of people have said very nice things about it. A lot of people in the industry have said, we laughed our socks off in the office. I spat my tea out over my keyboard in the office reading this today, blah, blah, blah. And that's really nice to hear. It's good to know that I think there's quite a lot of people in whiskey that work for these big companies that don't always agree either with some of the silly things that they do. I heard one of the best things I ever heard was that the Edrington or Macallan had some kind of meeting about the sponge to decide what to do. I don't know, maybe they could have stomped on it and sent some really brutal lawyers into action and really got it, scuppered. I don't know, but it was quite funny to hear that it had provoked some kind of serious meeting at some stage in the past. So yeah, that was quite funny, really. But yeah, of course, there's been feedback, there's been reaction, there's been lawyers, etc., all this stuff, but it's never gotten to any kind of really severe or extreme stage.
So I'm waiting for the article that I write that will elicit that at some point. I wrote one that I thought was going to, and I'll share that with you separately offline. But yeah, no reaction so far.
I think most big companies recognize that they're the big guys, and if they react, then publicly they're the bullies. You can't win in that situation. You just have to kind of take it on the chin and absorb it. That's the point of being the big guy, is that you got to take criticism. You have to, because otherwise you just look like a petulant bully.
Right.
Yeah. So
so for the last portion of the interview, you mentioned at the very beginning you've finally got a distillery.
Yeah.
Or you're starting a distillery. And you've said in the past you would do, this is a direct quote, you would do despicable things to have your own bonded warehouse.
Yeah, that's true.
So
still true.
What's the status? What's the news on it?
So we've just got planning permission. So Kythe Distillery is the name, and the founders are myself, Johnny McMillan, who I've been good friends with for years, worked on the Whiskey Show Old and Rare with, and he's been sort of quite senior in Berry Brothers doing their bonded whiskey buying and trading and bottling for a number of years now. And also Aaron Chan, who similarly is another really good friend who I met through, like a lot of people I met through, shared passion for old and rare whiskies. And he owns Club Ching, bar and bottler and importer in Hong Kong. And he was really been one of the big driving forces behind the project in terms of helping Johnny and I sort of articulate our vision in the form of a really strong financial model. And he helped with the fundraise and everything. So we're now at a position where we've fully funded, planning permission approved. The site is nearly ready to start to have groundworks commence. And when I say groundworks, it's quite straightforward. It's two big agricultural buildings which are going to be reclad and prepared for installation of kit. So we've got one for the distillery and one for the bonded warehouse. And yeah, I often say that I should be a lot more excited than I am, but I'm just very conscious of all the stories that surround every distillery project that's ever been undertaken, and how you can go over budget, you can completely fail, it doesn't happen, it doesn't get across the line for any number of reasons. Things take way longer than anticipated, there's unforeseen problems of any and all sort. So I try to bear all that in mind and not be too excited, but I am incredibly excited, and it's a really it's a thrilling thing to be a part of, and it's a huge challenge as well, but it's an opportunity for us to put other people's money where our mouths are, and to put into practice all the things we've been saying and talking and communicating about old style whiskey production, all these things. So it's kind of squeaky bum time in many ways, but we wouldn't be doing this if we weren't confident we could make something really special, and that we've got the right people, we've got the right ideas, the right contacts, and I think we've got a very clear objective, a very clear plan. We want to make old style, distillate driven, textural, fat, charismatic, fruity Highland malt whiskey of the best kind, of the oldest style, of the most vivid, singular, distinctive character. And we want to make whiskey which tastes of its distillery and is built on the foundation of impeccable, beautiful distillate, rounded off by wood, not dominated by wood. And I think that's a really, that's a mission statement, and it's a big challenge, because we've got to make a product that has nowhere to hide. And so at the moment, everything is going reasonably according to plan. There's a battle to keep costs down, as there always is, and especially at the the present economic circumstances, where you've got to grapple with Brexit, inflation, and cost of materials, cost of transport, all sorts of things which are kind of against you. But we've got an amazing team. We've got some brilliant engineering minds. We've got a good diversity in our team in terms of some real industry long-term experience, along with younger, very, very creative, very, very sort of dogmatic value engineer type guys who have got perhaps more of a guerrilla approach to developing distilleries, designing and problem solving and engineering. And that is, I think, what's going to really see us through, is the team and the quality of the minds that are working on this project. So yeah, as I say, it's extremely exciting, but I will probably allow myself to be audibly more excited when we've got 15-year-old product on the market, I would say.
That's fair. Like, it's, yeah, as you said, it's a huge undertaking for anybody. It's hard to, I fully understand, it's hard to articulate that excitement without the kind of unknowns sneak into.
There's always a note of caution. There's always a caveat.
Of course.
But like, nothing ventured, nothing gained.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest undertakings and the greatest successes are usually off the back of the biggest risks. But in my view, we've done about as much as possible to mitigate this risk. The founders, the shareholders are all whiskey people. There's no corporate money, there's no venture capital money. There's only cash in this project from diehard whiskey geeks that love old style whiskey, believe in our vision, believe in us as individuals, and believe in the plan, and have scrutinized the numbers and fully support what we are endeavoring to achieve. And I think that's one of the big foundational strengths of this project, is it has the right people on the production design aspect, the engineering aspect, as I just alluded to, but also in the funding aspect, the financial support aspect. And then I think that it's just a matter of being studious, making sure that we make the right decisions, being as careful and meticulous as possible in how we move forward. And all being well, we should be able to start distilling. At the moment, the window is sometime between mid to late 2024. So if we can do it before the end of 2024, that'll be a great win. And then the next phase is putting our ideas into practice. And again, this idea of being meticulous and focusing on answering our questions. What do we do if we do this? What does it happen if we tweak this? Isolating all these examples of spirit, making sure we keep a very close eye on them as they develop, understand what is the right approach with our equipment, what is the right model and method that's going to deliver what we want. And that's something, that's obviously, probably the biggest challenge in this whole venture, is getting to the point where we're confident that we have got the profile, the character, and the level of quality that we know we need to make this a success. So yeah, those first few years are going to be absolutely critical, as they are with any distillery. But I think we've got, as I said, I go back to this idea that the right ideas, the right team, we're lining up the right ingredients in terms of barley, in terms of casks. So I think, at this stage, I'm about as confident as I dare say I am, but it is exciting, undeniably, and I'm a very impatient person, as is Johnny. We're both very keenly aware that we'll fill the first cask and then spontaneously explode with frustration and impatience. So it'll be a very, very long first 3 years. And not that we're going to release anything at 3 years, but just, to hit that, line in the sand where you can say, we have made single malt Scotch whiskey. But, it'll be pretty thrilling along the way. And it'll be a huge weight off the shoulders once we start to see things physically take shape, like the stills delivered. And I think that'll be a real, change in the feeling and change in the level of confidence, I'm sure.
And as we're recording last night, I was talking to Mark Westmoreland from Wolfburn, and he repeated to me on that episode, but has also said separately that the top accolade that he and the team want to achieve is for someone 10, 15 years down the line from now to try something, not know what it is, and say, that's Wolfburn.
Yeah.
Be identifiable. And he's also got other elements that match up in terms of how they want to use the wood management and not to enhance the spirit and add to it as opposed to hiding it. So there were parallels in my mind going on as you were speaking. I was thinking, oh, that's something that was said as well. So, number one, we'll definitely have you on again to talk about down the line how the distillery is doing, and once the kid is in,
come on together. Really, we should get Johnny and myself on, because it's good to have us both there, because he covers aspects of it in greater detail that I don't, and vice versa. And so, I think that's the thing about Kythe, is that we are a team. It's not just one individual. It's a collective endeavor by, like, at the heart of it, three very, very passionate people with quite diverse experiences and backgrounds. And I think that's, the great strength that, sits at the heart of the project. So absolutely, we would love to come back on and chat about it once we're a bit further along the road and we've got some more things to talk about and report on.
Absolutely. So I'll tell you the first question that came to mind, and we'll end on this, is that the first question that came to mind as you were describing what you want from the distillery is, given your history, your proclivity for older whiskeys, you just said you want something that evokes that older spirit and the way that it was created, and the fruitiness, the floral, the tropical notes. And don't answer this now. We'll save that for the next episode. But I'm curious how the stills and the entire distillery are being designed with that thought in mind. That's the character spirit that you want to create.
Well, I mean, the one thing I'll say about that just now is that they have been designed exactly with that character in mind. Every single piece of the production process, almost down to things like pipework, has been gone over from the perspective of what is the right decision to make here to deliver holistically, at the end of the day, the best possible quality spirit, the best possible quality malt whiskey that has the personality of very fat, very heavy, distillate driven, tropical fruit dominated, waxy, old style Highland malt whiskey. So in terms of what the answer is and the decisions we've made, the sort of the specifics of our kit and everything, then I think absolutely that's a great discussion topic to stick a peg in for the future and revisit.
All right, we will definitely do so. And I guess a quick question on that, is it, will it be more or less complicated than Mortlock?
Less.
Okay,
less.
Good. Thank God.
Absolutely, no. It's not going to be a sort of an intricate juggling process like Mortlach or even Springbank in some ways. No, it's traditional double pot still distillation, but just introducing things like direct wood firing of a wash still, which is not something that's really been done. I mean, direct coal firing was the last kind of direct, flame heat source outside gas in Scotland, and I don't know anyone that's done wood in, legally in recent decades. So yeah, absolutely. There's a whole load of stuff like that about that to discuss in more detail, but it's probably one for after we've started making spirit and we understand ourselves exactly how our theory about it has worked in practice and how it all fits together and how it operates, and because that'll be a big learning curve as well once we get started.
Well, it's a date. You'll be back on. We'll bring on Johnny. We'll bring on the entire team, whoever you would like to come on to talk about that, because then we can get really nerdy into the process. But in the meantime, Angus, thank you so much for taking the time today to talk about the Sponge. We didn't even talk that much about Decadent Drinks, and we should at some point too.
I'm gonna get in trouble with my marketing manager for not talking about Decadent Drinks. Don't worry. I'm very happy to come back on anytime and chat about any of these things.
True.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed chatting to you. It's been a really nice way to spend a Friday afternoon.
Fantastic. And thank you everyone for bearing with my slightly altered voice today. It's a little cloudier than it usually is. But in the meantime, there will be a ton more than usual links in the show notes for this episode to not only the Sponge, but to Decadent Drinks. I'm also going to include a link to Pure Malts, our mutual friend James's group here based in New York, just because Angus has been gracious enough to come on multiple times and do tastings with the group. And hell, I'm sitting here with my favorite, the old Rhosdhu.
Beautiful dram. Yeah, that's really old, kind of old school Loch Lomond, very fruity, cosplaying as an Irish whiskey. Yeah, I love it. Do you mind if I do one completely flagrant plug?
Please.
Because it's our archive sale next week. It's our summer archive sale, and we're going to be doing shipping deals, so free shipping worldwide on orders over 200 quid. And there's going to be a whole load of sort of formerly sold out products that we've got little bits of stock here and there going up online. So, from next week onwards, keep an eye on the website and our socials, and there should be some pretty tasty bottles going up. So, yeah, okay, plug over. I'm very bad.
No, totally fine. I don't know time wise if this might come out afterwards, but I will make sure. If it does come out afterwards, I'll make sure to post about it, because that's how I got some of my bottles, was through a separate sale like that. It was completely worth it. So if you can, shoot me the dates and all that, and I will make sure to post about it. I'm a huge fan. And yeah, again, just thank you for coming on, man. Hang on with me for a sec after recording to close out a few things. It's been another episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. Check out all of the show notes for this episode. You're going to want to hit all of them. Don't miss a thing. And I will see you next week.
Hey folks, thanks for listening to another episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. If you like what you hear, please go ahead and click that subscribe, follow, or like button. Leave a rating and review on your podcast app of choice, and let me know what you want to hear. You can reach out to me through the podcast apps, or email me at david@whiskymyweddingring.com with any suggestions or ideas for new show guests. You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/whiskeyinmyweddingring. That's whiskey with an E, for as little as $1 a month. $5 a month gets you access to bonus content, including our soon-to-resume Under the Influencer series, and $25 a month means you join the Barrel Share Club. Each month, Barrel Share Club members get to try products sent to me for review, bottles from my own collection, and sometimes bottles that I just pick up because they're fun or interesting. Right now, only 5 spots remain in the Barrel Share Club, so grab your place today. Finally, please follow on Instagram. You can follow me at Whiskey in My Wedding Ring or at Whiskey Ring Podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Whiskey Ring. You can follow on Facebook at Whiskey in My Wedding Ring, or join the Facebook group, the Whiskey Ringers group. And I hope to see you there. Cheers, thank you for the support, and see you next time.